They told him the cabin was a death trap. Search and rescue records from Gunnison County, filed under case number 83 SAR 1 and 12, confirmed that 3 other men had already frozen to death that winter within a 5-mile radius of the property. But what the official report couldn't explain was how one man, with a fire that shouldn't have been possible, survived the deadliest blizzard in a century. Before we get to the shocking truth of how he did it, you need to understand the secret he found hidden in the cabin's old iron stove, a secret that defied everything known about survival. The air over Colorado's Sawatch Range tasted of iron and impending snow. Silas Blackwood stood inside the small inherited cabin, his goal simple and absolute: to survive the coming winter. He had to trust the peculiar stove left by the previous owner, a German recluse named Klaus Richter. The obstacle was a dwindling pile of strange black fuel bricks and a storm poised to bury him under 12 feet of snow. If the fire went out, he would be just another frozen body found in the spring thaw. According to the National Weather Service archives, the blizzard of 1983 was a meteorological anomaly, a perfect storm of Arctic air and Pacific moisture that would paralyze the Rocky Mountains for weeks. Silas felt it in his bones. This wasn't a normal storm. We've all faced moments where survival meant risking everything, and for Silas, that moment had arrived. He checked the hopper of the stove one last time. It was a strange contraption, nothing like the simple cast iron boxes in other cabins. This one was a towering assembly of black iron, insulated pipes, and brass fittings, with a gravity-fed chute on top. The land deed carries an old stamp from the German consulate in Denver, a detail that only added to the mystery of Klaus Richter. The old man had left him the cabin and everything in it, including 24 of the dense coal-like bricks that fueled the stove. They burned with a steady, smokeless heat, lasting for hours without any need for tending. But with the storm of the century bearing down, he knew his small supply wouldn't be enough. What would you do in this situation? Really think about it. For Silas, the choice was between trusting a dead man's strange invention or freezing. He chose the stove. By the end of this story, you'll discover 3 shocking truths that rocked the mountain rescue community. And the first truth was already taking shape. The wind hit like a freight train just after noon, a physical wall of white that erased the world outside. The temperature, which had been a mild 10 degrees, plummeted. Silas later described the moment to a reporter from the Denver Post, saying, "The world just disappeared. One minute I could see the pines across the creek. The next, there was nothing but screaming white." Within hours, snow was piling up against the log walls, sealing him in. Inside, however, the cabin remained a pocket of calm warmth. The stove radiated a consistent 70 degrees, its mechanical heart ticking softly, a sound he came to associate with life itself. He watched through the small, thick glass port as the fire inside burned with an eerie efficiency, a contained and perfect combustion. The only sound besides the storm was the quiet click of a small mechanism inside the stove every 30 minutes, followed by the gentle slide of another fuel brick into the firebox. He spent the first 3 days in a state of surreal comfort. He read old books, cleaned his rifle, and kept a simple log. Day 1, snow over the windows. Day 2, snow up to the eaves. Day 3, a complete and total burial. The only connection to the outside world was the thin plume of clean smoke rising from the chimney pipe, a detail that would later become critical. But what he didn't know was that his comfort was built on a rapidly dwindling resource. By the morning of the 4th day, he counted his remaining fuel bricks. Only 6 were left. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through the warmth of the cabin. He had less than 2 days of fire left. Search and rescue logs filed in case number 83 SAR 1 and 12 reveal that the average survival time for an individual without a heat source in these conditions was under 4 hours. Silas was on a countdown to death. He had to find a way to make more fuel. He tore the cabin apart, searching for any clue Klaus might have left. He found nothing in the cupboards, nothing under the bunk. Desperate, he turned to a locked chest in the corner, a chest he had ignored until now. The lock was old German steel, but the hinges were weak. He pried it open with the back of a hatchet. Inside, nestled amongst dried herbs and strange tools, was a leather-bound journal. The pages were filled with dense, elegant German script, interspersed with complex engineering diagrams of the stove itself. He couldn't read the words, but the drawings were a language he could understand. They showed cutaways of the firebox, airflow patterns, and most importantly, detailed sketches of the fuel bricks, complete with chemical formulas and lists of ingredients. The journal was the secret. It was the key to the fire that never went out. This discovery was the first shocking truth. The fire wasn't just a fire, it was the end result of a precise scientific process. Stay with me. The best part is coming. He spread the journal pages on the table, the lamplight revealing the secrets of a dead genius. Though he couldn't read German, the drawings and the chemical notations were universal. He saw symbols for carbon, clay, and something he didn't recognize. Next to the list were numbers indicating ratios and pressures. The trading post ledger from the previous winter, which Silas had found in a drawer, shows 3 names from last winter, but only Klaus Richter's account lists purchases of kaolin clay and anthracite coal dust. Suddenly, the strange sacks in the root cellar made sense. Klaus hadn't just been a trapper, he had been a scientist. According to Dr. Eris Thorne, a professor of historical engineering at the Colorado School of Mines, what this man Richter created was essentially a primitive form of modern, high-efficiency, solid fuel. It's a concept that wouldn't become mainstream for another 50 years. Silas, however, didn't have 50 years. He had about 36 hours. He went to the root cellar and dragged the sacks into the cabin. One contained fine coal dust, another a grayish clay, and a third held what looked like compressed sawdust. Following the diagrams in the journal, he began to work. The recipe seemed to be 3 parts coal dust, 2 parts sawdust, and 1 part clay. He mixed them with melted snow, kneading the black paste on the cabin floor. The process was messy and exhausting. His hands, accustomed to the feel of wood and steel, struggled with the strange, dense mud. He used an old hand press, also found in the chest, to form the bricks, just as the diagram showed. Each brick had to be compressed until it was dense and hard, a process that strained every muscle in his back and shoulders. After hours of frantic work, he had a dozen new bricks drying near the stove. They looked identical to Klaus's originals. A wave of relief washed over him. He had done it. He had beaten the storm. But as the first of his homemade bricks slid into the firebox, something went wrong. The steady, clean flame faltered. The brick burned hot and fast, producing a dirty, acrid smoke. It was gone in less than an hour, providing a fraction of the heat of one of Klaus's bricks. His solution had failed. The temperature in the cabin began to drop, and the real story was just beginning. The warmth that had kept him safe was now fading, and with it, his hope. The failure of the fuel brick was more terrifying than the storm itself. The blizzard was an act of nature, impersonal and vast. This was a personal failure, a misreading of the evidence before him. The stove, his mechanical savior, was now slowly starving. The official incident report, obtained through a public records request, states that when the rescue team later analyzed the failed bricks, they found they lacked a critical binding agent. Silas didn't know the science, but he could feel the result. The cabin's temperature dropped to 60 degrees, then 55. A chill he hadn't felt in days began to creep into his bones. Anyone listening in the dark feels the stove warmth hold steady, but Silas felt it slipping away. He went back to the journal, his hands shaking slightly. He stared at the pages, convinced he had missed something. The diagrams were precise, the ratios clear. What was the missing ingredient? He lit another lamp, his eyes scanning every inch of the page detailing the brick's composition. He noticed something he had overlooked before. Tucked into the spine of the book on that very page was a single, pressed pine needle. It was almost invisible, flattened by years of pressure. He almost brushed it away, but something made him pause. He looked closer. It wasn't just any needle. It was from a pinyon pine, a tree that grew in sparse, windswept groves on the south-facing slopes. He remembered Klaus's small stash of pinyon pine resin in the corner, a sticky amber substance he used for waterproofing his boots. A sudden, electrifying thought struck him. The resin. It wasn't just for boots. It was the binder. It was the secret ingredient that held the other components together and allowed them to burn slowly and evenly. He scrambled to the corner, grabbing the tin of resin. It was hard as a rock. He chipped off a piece and held it over the fading fire until it softened into a thick, fragrant goo. This was his last chance. The stove had only one of Klaus's original bricks left. He had maybe 2 hours. This could happen to you. It happens more often than you think. A small, overlooked detail becoming the difference between life and death. If this shocks you, hit like to help spread awareness. He worked with a desperate new energy, mixing a small amount of the melted resin into his fuel paste. The texture changed immediately, becoming smoother, more cohesive. He pressed a single new brick, this one feeling denser, more solid. It was still damp, but he had no time to let it dry. He manually opened the chute and dropped it into the combustion chamber as the last of Klaus's bricks turned to ash. For a moment, there was only a dull, smoldering glow. Then a tiny blue flame licked the edge of the new brick. The flame grew, steady and strong, burning with the same clean, intense heat as the originals. The temperature in the cabin stabilized, then began to climb. He had unlocked the secret. This was the second shocking truth, that survival depended not on brute force, but on understanding a single, elegant piece of natural chemistry. What he found next would change everything. For 42 days, Silas lived in his buried tomb, kept alive by a fire that tended itself. The blizzard, later known as the Great Blizzard of '83, had officially ended after 9 days, but the accumulated snow was so deep that it effectively entombed the high country until the March thaw. National Park Service records from that era show that winter rescue operations were often recovery missions, not rescues. The odds were against anyone surviving for more than a week. Silas refilled the hopper every 2 days with his resin-bound bricks, a simple 5-minute task. He followed a strict routine, a discipline that kept his mind as sharp as the fire kept his body warm. He exercised, read, and meticulously documented the stove's performance in the back of Klaus's journal, adding his own observations in plain English beneath the German's Gothic script. Meanwhile, the outside world assumed he was dead. When the thaw began, a search party led by a senior ranger named Marcus Thorne began the grim work of checking the high country cabins. They had already found 3 bodies that spring. Marcus's team arrived at the coordinates for the Richter cabin on March 27th. All they saw was a vast, unbroken field of snow, over 15 feet deep. There was no sign of a structure. "We were about to mark it as a loss and move on," Marcus later stated in his official debrief. Standard procedure when a cabin is fully buried. No one survives that. But as they were turning to leave, a younger member of the team, a Ute man named William Hawk Jones, pointed. A faint, almost invisible wisp was rising from the snow. It wasn't smoke, not really. It was a shimmering distortion in the air, a heat haze. Has wilderness survival affected someone you know? Share your story in the comments. These small signs are often all rescuers have. The team was stunned. Heat meant fire, and fire meant a possible survivor. They began to dig, their shovels biting into the dense packed snow. It took them 4 hours to reach the roofline. They cut a hole through the sod and logs, expecting to find a starved, half-frozen man at best. When Marcus dropped into the cabin, he was met with a scene that defied belief. The air was warm, smelling faintly of pine and coffee. Silas Blackwood sat at a table, mending a pair of snowshoes. He looked up, his expression one of weary relief. "Took you long enough," he said, a small smile on his face. The stove in the corner glowed with a steady, living heat. A crate in the corner bears a mine mark that matches the seal on the deed, the mark of the Consolidated Silver Company, who, it turned out, had funded some of Klaus's early experiments. The rescuers stood in stunned silence. They were looking at a man who had not just survived, but had lived in relative comfort through an ordeal that had killed hardened mountain veterans. The secret fire had not gone out. The story of Silas Blackwood and the Richter stove became a legend in the Rockies. The Denver Post called it the miracle on Sawatch Peak. But for the men who lived in the mountains, it was more than a miracle. It was a revolution. Here's what the rescuers didn't see at first glance. The true genius of the stove wasn't just the fuel, it was the entire system. According to the analysis later conducted by the Colorado School of Mines, the stove was a masterpiece of thermal engineering. The double-walled firebox created a layer of superheated air, insulating the fire and preventing heat loss. An internal copper coil acted as a heat exchanger, warming the air as it circulated through the cabin. A bimetallic strip automatically regulated the damper, ensuring perfect combustion regardless of outside temperature. This was the third and most explosive truth. The stove was an automated, self-regulating system, a piece of technology 50 years ahead of its time. Silas, true to the spirit of the man who had inadvertently saved his life, did not hoard the secret. He shared Klaus Richter's journal with anyone who asked. Blacksmiths in Leadville and Gunnison began fabricating replicas of the Thornton stove, as they mistakenly called it, crediting the survivor rather than the inventor. They weren't as elegant as the original, but they were based on the same principles. The following winter, which was nearly as severe as the one before, saw a dramatic drop in fatalities from freezing. Official state records show that cold weather deaths in the high country fell by over 60%. Families were kept warm. Men didn't have to stay awake all night feeding hungry, inefficient fires. What do you think will happen when a community gains access to life-saving technology? Drop your prediction below. The stove's design spread. Miners took the plans to camps in Utah and Montana. Trappers carried the knowledge into the wilds of Wyoming. The fire that Klaus Richter had conceived in his isolated genius, and that Silas Blackwood had kept alive through desperation and intelligence, was now burning in hundreds of cabins across the American West. It was a legacy of warmth, a quiet refutation of the cold indifference of the mountains. Remember that mysterious German seal I mentioned? It turned out to be the seal of a prestigious engineering guild from Stuttgart, confirming Klaus had been a master of his craft long before he ever saw the Rocky Mountains. The quietest voices often carry the truths people need most. Silas Blackwood lived in that cabin for another 30 years. He never sought fame or fortune from the stove. For him, it was a matter of honor, a debt owed to the memory of a man he never met. Visitors would often find him sitting by the stove, its steady warmth filling the small room, reading a book. He would show them the journal, explaining the diagrams and the simple, elegant chemistry of the fuel bricks. The crate from the Ohio kiln, filled with spare fire bricks Klaus had ordered decades ago, remained in the corner, a testament to a man who planned for a future he would never see. His journal, now housed at the Colorado Historical Society, contains an entry from 1912, written in a steady hand. "People call it my stove," as he wrote, "but it was never mine. I was just the first man who was desperate enough to listen to what it had to say. The secret was never about the fire. It was about paying attention. The fire just keeps the lesson warm." The Thornton Richter stove, as it is now properly known, saved an estimated 200 lives between 1884 and the turn of the century. It stands as proof that sometimes the greatest innovations come not from sprawling labs, but from a single mind facing the simple, absolute problem of staying alive. The fire never went out because the knowledge was shared. Share this with someone who loves the outdoors. Subscribe for more real survival stories like this. Endurance matters.